Peters stretched out his arm and slowly turned the volume control, filling the interior of the patrol car with the muted rhythm of the radio. Outside the window, the night was scattered with thousands of neon lights reflecting in the wet asphalt. There was a familiar smell in the air, a mixture of fresh rain, gasoline, and something else, almost elusive, like a premonition. He loved those night shifts, when the city went to sleep, leaving the streets to the likes of him. He drove slowly down the main avenue. The traffic was sparse, and the only offenders were teenagers riding motorcycles and a few cab drivers who pushed the throttle a little harder than they should. "Listening to your old wave again?" came a voice from the radio. It was Blake, his partner from the neighboring patrol. "You just don't understand good music, buddy." Peters grinned, putting the radio to his mouth. Well. Okay, I'm on break. Hope it's a quiet night." "Quiet," Peters repeated mentally, knowing full well that such words never came true, and then, as if by order, his eyes caught something strange. Ahead, at the intersection, under the traffic light, there was a car that immediately attracted his attention. Dark, glossy, expensive. The black body glistened under the streetlights like a predatory animal lurking before a leap. The traffic light flashed green, but the car didn't move. 2 seconds. 3. Then, abruptly, without turning, without warning, it took off, speeding through the intersection on yellow, balancing on the edge of the violation. Peters squinted his eyes. Well. Let's see who we have here. With its flashing lights on, it accelerated smoothly, catching up with the mysterious driver. There was something about this car that clung, not just because of the maneuver. There was more to this city than that. It was as if he'd just entered a game he didn't yet know the rules of. But something told him. This night was definitely not going to be a quiet one. Red and blue flashes of flashing lights slid across the perfectly polished hood of her car. Peters slowed down, assessing the situation before getting out. Usually, at times like this, drivers are nervous. Some immediately scramble for their papers, others fidget, anticipating a ticket. But she didn't even move. Through the slightly tinted glass, he could see her long fingers tapping the steering wheel to the beat of soft music. As he came closer, she turned her head, and in the light of the street lamps her face lit up for a moment, an expression of complete calmness, even a slight challenge. She didn't look at him as a representative of the law, rather as someone she had been waiting for a long time. Peters didn't find her voice right away. Her skin glowed in the soft light of the cabin, her hair falling over her shoulder in a way that made him want to follow the movement of every strand. When she finally opened the window, he was greeted by a light trail of something warm, subtle, a combination of perfume and the heat of her skin. "Good evening, miss." His voice sounded deeper than usual, and he noticed it. "Good evening, officer." Her voice was as it should be, soft but tinged with something darker, more dangerous. She didn't pull out her papers, didn't make a single movement, waiting to see what he would say next. The slightest tilt of her head, a half-smile she was acting. Peters took a breath, chasing away the strange feeling as if this whole moment had been preordained. "Do you know why I stopped you?" She ran her finger along the edge of the steering wheel a little slower than she should have. "Let's say I'm guessing. But I didn't cross the red light, did I?" Her tone was light, almost playful, as if they knew each other and he'd caught her doing something more interesting than breaking traffic laws. "Intersection, yellow signal. You slowed down and then you started abruptly." "Ah, yellow." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze warm but provocative. I always thought yellow was an invitation to make a choice. And you, officer, do you like people to make good choices? He blinked, felt the barely perceptible tension seep into the air between them. She wasn't just answering, she was leading him. I love it when people respect the rules, Ms. Olivia. She said it like she wanted him to remember, or maybe she wanted his lips to remember what her name sounded like. Olivia. He repeated it. The name seemed familiar to him for some reason. She moved slightly, getting more comfortable, her shoulder lightly touching the edge of the window. A slow movement, like a dance, without a single gesture. And your name, officer? Or should I just call you sir? Peters. She smiled, studiously, like she was tasting the name. I like it. It sounds right. Shit. He should have gotten the documents. Should have gotten things back on track. But instead, he watched as she slid her hand lightly over his neck, her fingers lingering for a moment at his collarbone, then back to the steering wheel. Her movements are not random. Would you let me see your driver's license? Of course. Her voice was just as soft, but something different flashed in her eyes. She reached for her purse, but did so in such a way that the thin fabric of the dress softly outlined the curve of her body. He shouldn't have been paying attention. He shouldn't have felt the air between them grow tighter than it had a moment ago. She slowly pulled out the ID card, handing it over so that her fingers lightly grazed his palm. It was a touch, barely perceptible, but as if charged with electricity. Peters did not take the document at once. They looked at each other a little longer than they should have. Is something wrong, officer? Olivia's voice was light, but there was more meaning in it than the words themselves. He took the ID card, but the feeling that he had just crossed some border did not leave him, and the weird thing was, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back. Peters stared at the ID in his hand, but his thoughts were far away. He seemed to be reading those letters for too long, just to keep from looking at her, from meeting her eyes, from letting himself notice how she was playing with him, as if this wasn't a routine checkup, but something else entirely. Do you often scrutinize documents this closely, officer? Olivia's voice slid across his mind, warm, with a slight chuckle. He looked up. She was no longer leaning on the seat. Now her elbow was on the window, her fingers lightly touching his cheek, a steady gaze, an elusive smile. I like to be considerate, Miss Olivia. She leaned a little closer, letting the light touch her skin, highlighting her delicate features, the curve of her lips, the slightly raised eyebrows. It sounds like you prefer to notice the smallest details. Peters did not answer at once. He could feel the air between them saturating with something invisible but tangible. It was as if it had grown from a routine check into something not regulated at all. He could end this right now, give her back her papers, say goodnight, and leave. But it was as if his own body slowed its reactions, refusing to make the obvious choice. Sometimes it's good for you. He didn't want his voice to waver, but something about her presence made him lose control a little. She leaned a little closer still, her lips curved in a soft grin. And sometimes it just gets in the way. He caught the subtle scent of her perfume, not intrusive, but creeping under his skin, making him wonder what other secrets she kept. Are you always this serious? Her voice was lower, almost conspiratorial. Or will you make an exception for me? Peters frowned, but it was more of a reaction to himself. He shouldn't have been drawn into this game. He shouldn't have felt her words leave a mark, like a light touch. Do you like to test the patience of police officers? Only if they're as interested in as you are. He almost exhaled a chuckle. She was too confident, too calm, and he didn't know if it was just a trait of hers or if she knew exactly what she was doing. She reached for her purse, her fingers sliding slowly over the suede surface. The movement was leisurely, as if she were deliberately stretching the moment. You're not afraid I might get something unexpected, are you, officer? Peters kept his eyes on her. I'm always ready for the unexpected. She grinned a little, as if she knew something he didn't. Then, finally, she pulled something small and shiny out of her purse. Keys. She twirled them lightly in her fingers, letting the light reflect on the metal surface. There. Now I have nothing suspicious. She bowed her head slightly, as if to imply that the most suspicious thing in this car was herself. Peters felt his fingers tighten on her driver's license. He hadn't returned it yet, which meant the conversation wasn't over. Why do I feel like you're deliberately delaying this moment? Because it's more interesting that way. And at that moment, she did something he never expected. Her hand slid across the glass and then moved forward slightly, her fingers lightly grazing his wrist. Just a little, for a split second. But he felt it. Her skin was warm, the movement soft, almost lazy, but there was more than mere casualness in that gesture. Olivia leaned closer, her voice a little quieter. Are you going to detain me, officer? Or are you going to let me drive? Peters stared at her. Something about this woman was wrong. Or the other way around. Too right, so much so that it was confusing. He should have let her go, but for some reason he felt like if he did it now, he'd miss something important. And it was weird, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to let go. Peters didn't move. The light touch of her fingers on his wrist was so fleeting that he could have written it off as an accident, but he knew it was no accident. She looked at him like she was studying him, like she was trying to see how far she could go. Something inside told him that this wasn't just an ordinary woman caught for a minor infraction. There was something different about her. Dangerous, tantalizing, confusing. Olivia leaned forward slightly and he noticed her lips curve into a thin half-smile. Are you always this strict, Officer Peters? Her voice got lower. There was a softness to it, but not the kind of softness that relaxes. It was more like the kind of softness that made the air thicker. Peters did not answer at once. He felt her presence disturbing the usual order of things. I'm just doing my job. She tilted her head slightly, scrutinizing him curiously, as if trying to pick him apart, to look deeper than she should. And you always follow the rules? She said it slowly, savoring each word as if it had a hidden meaning. Peters clenched his jaw. He had to put a stop to this conversation, should have given her back her papers and left. But somehow he couldn't. Olivia shifted slightly, and he caught the movement of her shoulder. Her whole look, from the lazy gaze to the way the light played on her skin, said one thing. She knew what she was doing, and that was the most dangerous part. Is something bothering you, officer? Her voice became almost a whisper. Peters blinked. Heart too fast, too close to the edge. You broke the rules. His voice was low and steady, but there was an inner struggle in it. Olivia tilted her head slightly to the side. Oh, what if I told you I like to break them sometimes? She said it so calmly, so innocently, that if it hadn't been for the look in her eyes, if it hadn't been for that slow play of her fingers on the steering wheel, you'd have thought it was a casual phrase. But it wasn't an accident. Peters suddenly realized that all his confidence, his familiar role, was now blurring like paint on glass in the rain. She wasn't just answering him. She was steering this conversation. "Will you check on me, officer?" She squeezed the steering wheel slightly, then gently unclenched her fingers. That tiny gesture caught his attention more than it should have. "Or are you going to make an exception?" Peters could feel her voice getting under his skin. Too slow, too attentive. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to regain control, but the air between them was no longer normal. He was electrified. "Minus Miss Olivia, I can't make exceptions." She chuckled softly, and the sound was like it touched something inside him. "Too bad." Her voice was barely audible. "You look like a man who would like to do one thing." And it was at that moment that he realized she was testing him. And it wasn't just flirting. It was more than that. Peters did not know what it was, but he felt that if he did not retreat now, he would find himself in a place from which he could not return. And, for some reason, he wasn't sure he wanted to back down. Olivia shook her head slightly, her lips curving into the same half-smile that made Peter's insides tighten. She was staring straight at him, taking her time, savoring every moment of their conversation, enjoying the way he was slowly but surely losing control. She reached out again, her fingers sliding lightly over the steering wheel, then gently into her own hair, fixing a strand as if the gesture were completely random. But Peters knew there was nothing casual about her. "If I give you rights, you'll still find a reason to detain me. Am I right?" Her voice was quiet, almost lazy, but there was more to it than mere provocation. It wasn't harmless flirtation. She knew what she was doing to him. He didn't answer right away. His fingers involuntarily gripped her driver's license a little tighter, as if that might help him regain control of the situation. "Minus Miss Olivia, I'm not in the habit of looking for excuses." She hummed, slowly leaning closer, resting her elbow on the window. There wasn't much space between them now, and Peters felt like if he made the slightest movement forward, he'd be too close. "Are you saying you're not interested in me?" He knew she was playing with him. He knew he shouldn't have answered. But damn it, somehow this seemed like the most difficult challenge he'd had in years. "I'm saying it doesn't matter." Her lips trembled slightly, as if from a suppressed chuckle. "Oh, officer." She paused, slowly running a finger along the edge of her sleeve. "I think you're wrong. It matters. Otherwise, you would have let me go a long time ago." He had to let her go. He should have. But he didn't. She knew it. He knew it. Peters could feel the tension between them reaching a point from which it was no longer possible to return. Olivia leaned in slightly, her shoulder touching the edge of the window, and now they were at the limit of their acceptable distance. "So, what's it gonna be, officer?" Her voice sounded soft, but there was hidden steel in that softness. It was as if she already knew the answer. He looked at her, and she looked at him. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. This wasn't just a roadside encounter. She's hiding something. But did it matter to him, which was which? Or was he interested in something else entirely? Her fingers slid slowly over the steering wheel, then, as if unintentionally, lightly grazed his hand as she took the papers back. The touch only lasted a moment, but it was enough. Peters could feel something changing. It's like he got into this game too late. And now only one question remained. Was he ready to play on? Peters felt the air in her car thicken, become viscous, heavy, Every move Olivia made, every word she said, pulled him deeper into that strange, mesmerizing pull he couldn't or wouldn't get out of. She wasn't in a hurry. On the contrary, she was stretching the moment, as if stretching the pleasure, as if testing how far he would let her go. Olivia leaned forward slowly, her long fingers sliding lazily over the steering wheel. Then she rested her elbow on the edge of the window, her face too close. His fingers reflexively clenched into a fist. He shouldn't have let it happen. He shouldn't have been standing here, so close. He shouldn't have smelled the light scent of her perfume mixed with the warmth of her skin. But he still didn't move. Her lips twitched in a barely perceptible grin. Something warm but dangerous flashed in her eyes, something that carried more than mere flirtation. "You do realize that I don't need a license to stay here longer, don't you?" She said it so quietly that the sound almost dissolved into the night. Peters felt her words get under his skin. Something inside him trembled. Uncertainty, or something else. "You're playing, Miss Olivia." His voice was a little husky, a little lower than usual. She smiled. "Quiet, dangerous. What about you?" She straightened slowly, but didn't pull away. Her knee was too close to the door now, and when she turned slightly, the fabric of the dress slid softly over her skin, exposing just enough to make his gaze linger a second longer than it should have. "I'm just doing my job." He made an attempt to get the conversation back on track. Olivia sighed, as if she was bored of hearing such words. "Really? Then why do I get the feeling you don't want to leave at all?" Peters closed his eyes for a moment. Her voice was smooth, mesmerizing, like a warm wave that was impossible to escape. He wanted to ask her, who was she? Why does she act like she knows his weaknesses? Or maybe he just wanted to do something he wasn't supposed to do. She slowly leaned toward him, her lips very close to his. "What's holding you back, officer?" Her breath was warm, and it touched his cheek. He knew he had to pull back, had to break the moment, but it was like his body wasn't listening. And then a thought flashed through his mind. Who is she really? That question kept him on his toes, and worst of all, he felt that the answer would change everything. Peters took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She moved too slowly, talked too softly, stared too intently. Everything about her seemed to draw him in, making him forget who he was and why he was here. But he couldn't afford to be what she wanted him to be. "Your papers, Miss Olivia." He expected that she would do it quickly, that she would hurry to get rid of his scrutiny, but she was in no hurry, of course. Olivia smirked, her lips slightly ajar, but not for a response, more to delay the moment a bit, to create even more tension. "You're so persistent, officer." Her fingers slid to her purse, and there was none of the usual fidgeting with which people pull out documents. She knew what she was doing. She was stretching the moment. She touched the zipper lightly, pulled it down slowly, and the sound seemed too loud for him in the silence of the night. Then her fingers slid inside, lingering there a fraction of a second longer than they should have. Peters watched her every move. Not because I didn't trust it, it was because I couldn't look away. She took the ID card out of her purse, twirled it slightly in her hands, as if hesitant to hand it over. Her fingers stroked the edge of the plastic and then slowly pulled the document forward, but not immediately into his hand. She held it between them, as if giving him the choice to take it or not. Her eyes sank into his, dark, deep, studying. He should have taken the document at once, but he lingered for a second, watching her fingers, the tips of her fingernails barely touching the plastic. Finally, he made a move to grab the ID, but at that moment her fingers accidentally grazed his. Accidentally? He felt the warmth of her skin, the slight pressure, and it reminded him again how close she'd let him get. Olivia smiled slightly, as if she realized he'd noticed. "Do you like me, officer?" "Shit." She kept playing. He didn't have to react. Shouldn't have let her influence him. Peters looked down, sharply, translating his gaze to the document in his hands. He slid his eyes over the photos, the name, the date of birth, and then everything clicked. He frowned. The name, a familiar one. It's too familiar. Somewhere in the back of his mind it was as if a flash had exploded, but he couldn't immediately see how he knew him. He looked at her again. Olivia continued to stare straight into his eyes, no longer just with playfulness, but with something much more. She knew something, and he, too, was beginning to realize that something was wrong here. "Olivia." He said her name slowly, as if tasting it. She smiled, knowing full well that in a second his world could turn upside down. Peters felt his heart slow down and his throat tighten at the sudden realization. He looked at the ID card in his hands again, and everything seemed to freeze. His gaze slid to the name, and suddenly everything became clear. Her father. A moment. It took him a few seconds to realize that the woman in front of him wasn't just a mysterious woman playing with him on the edge. No, she was something much more. Memories flashed through his mind, pictures of the past, details that suddenly came together like a jigsaw puzzle. Her father, a man whose name was on everyone's lips, a man known for his connections and influence, and including the fact that his name never stayed in the shadows. He was one of those who could do everything, including life and death decisions. Peters felt his throat go dry. He stood with the ID in his hands, as if it was now heavier than just a piece of paper. She wasn't just a lady on the road who broke the rules. She was the daughter of a man who could ruin his career with a single word. He tried to hold his breath, but it was impossible. The certainty was gone, and the lightness of the moment was instantly replaced by the heaviness of the realization. Everything that had seemed ordinary now took an unexpected and frightening turn. She noticed the change in his face, and her smile grew even wider. It was as if she were enjoying the way he was immersed in this unknown, the way it was capturing his attention more and more. Olivia didn't take her gaze away, her eyes sparkling like two lights as she realized he'd realized the truth. She didn't rush to speak. It was like a game. Silence filled the air, but it was different now. It allowed him to comprehend what had happened, but it gave him no escape. "So, officer, are you beginning to realize who you're dealing with?" Her voice became barely audible, but even more intrusive. Peters froze, not knowing what to say. His lips were dry, and he felt his insides pounding. This woman, her father, now it all seemed like a trap he'd fallen into, and there was no turning back. She bowed her head slightly, and his gaze fell on her face again. Her smile grew a little wider, but there was no fear or threat in her eyes. On the contrary, there was satisfaction in them. She was taking pleasure in once again making him question what he should be doing. Peters tried to find the words, but he couldn't. His mind refused to accept the fact that he was just talking to the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city. This conversation was no longer just a casual flirtation. It was a round stone that was rolling downhill, and there was no stopping it now. Olivia noticed his confusion and didn't look away. Her hand slid smoothly across the surface of the seat, lightly trailing down his arm. She did it so that he felt the touch and was once again at her mercy. You didn't expect that, did you? He realized she was aware of his thoughts. He felt his body react to her presence. This moment was not ordinary. It was full of danger. Not physical, but rather psychological. "Can I help you with something, officer?" Her voice had softened, but it had that same warm, mysterious tinge to it again, as if she were offering him a choice that wasn't a choice. Her words sounded like a challenge, and Peters felt his heart begin to beat faster. This wasn't just a conversation between a policeman and a citizen. This was a temptation he'd fallen into, and now he couldn't get out. He finally looked up and met her gaze. She knew he would play by her rules now. The silence in the car was thicker than before. Peters sat unmoving, his fingers still clutching Olivia's ID, but there was no thought in his mind of returning the documents or ending this strange conversation. He felt the air between them growing thicker and heavier, the tension in his body growing with every look she gave him. He felt that he was no longer in control of the situation, that she now held all the strings in her hands. Olivia noticed how silent he was, how his expression changed, and it made her smile even wider. She leaned a little closer, her breath noticeably warmer, and he involuntarily smelled her scent as it wafted through his mind, filling his thoughts. She stared at him intently, as if watching with interest as he dealt with the sudden loss of control. "What happened, officer?" Her voice was soft, but there wasn't an ounce of regret in it. It was full of curiosity, but not with sympathy, but with dark pleasure. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Peters didn't answer right away. He tried to collect his thoughts, but they blurred like a fog. This game, which he had thought was a flirtation, now took on a completely different connotation. His perception of what was happening was becoming distorted. He realized more and more that this was more than just an acquaintance, more than just a game between a cop and an intruder. She knew what she was doing, and he was probably just a pawn on her chessboard. He closed his eyes, trying to deal with that realization, but it still wouldn't let him go. He looked at her again, and her eyes were no longer so much fun as victory. She wasn't playing anymore. She was already winning. "You're too good at manipulation, Miss Olivia." His voice sounded restrained, but there was something different about it, something he couldn't hide. She tilted her head slightly, but her smile didn't fade. Her eyes sparkled. "Manipulate?" she repeated, as if scrutinizing his reaction. "Officer, don't you think I'm just testing you?" Her words seemed to pierce the air. He felt his chest tighten and his breathing become a little more shallow. She wasn't just playing, she was testing him, his reactions, his weaknesses. She was ready to unravel him, and now Peters realized that he didn't know what to expect of himself. She slowly moved a little closer, and her hand, which had seemed casual, now touched his shoulder. It was a slight touch, but it made him tense up. He shouldn't have let himself feel it. He should have taken a step back, regained his grip on the situation. But instead, he sat there, unmoving, letting her touch linger too long. "I wonder, are you always this tense?" Her voice was almost a whisper, and her lips were very close, on the verge of touching his skin. "Or is it just for me?" Her words were seeping into his mind, and he wasn't sure where his thoughts ended and her influence began. He tried to find an answer, something that would give him back control of the situation, but nothing came to mind. Only one thing. What if this game wasn't really about him? What if she was only testing him as one small detail in a huge picture? Peters felt his fingers clench involuntarily again, and he struggled to find the words. "You're not just testing me, Miss Olivia. You're trying to make me doubt who I am." He said it with a kind of furtive determination, but the feeling of loss of control persisted. She chuckled softly. That sound, that laugh, seemed to crash into his mind. She wasn't surprised by his words. She was almost pleased. "Do you doubt it? Or are you just afraid of what you're about to find out?" Her eyes grew darker, and she seemed to see him all too clearly. Peters tried to gather his thoughts. He had to ask himself a question. How does he really feel? What is he really doing? He wasn't prepared for this turn of events. What if this whole game wasn't about tying him down? She was playing not only with him, but with his view of the world, his work ethic, his life. She could ruin it all with one move, one word. And maybe she wasn't just doing it for fun. She wanted to see how far he'd go. Peters stood, clutching the ID card in his hands, his eyes still fixed on the car as it started to move. Olivia drove smoothly, and her dark car disappeared into the night, leaving behind only a slight trail of mystery that still hung in the air. He couldn't believe she'd driven away, leaving him with this sense of unspoken meaning, this overwhelming shock that was now like a stone in his chest. She was gone, and all he felt was one thing: uncertainty. His mind was trying to make sense of what had just happened, but he still couldn't put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Every word, every move she made, every look she gave him, it was all part of something bigger that he couldn't and wouldn't guess. She wasn't just playing with him. She made him question who he really was and why. Once in front of her, he suddenly lost control. He didn't know if her intentions were a vicious game or something far more dangerous. He sighed, feeling the emptiness fill his mind. He tried to process everything that had happened, but he felt his body stay where she'd left it, in the gap between desire and understanding. The car disappeared around the corner, and Peters, unable to remain motionless any longer, walked slowly away from the road. His steps were heavy, as if each one took away some of the strength, some of the clarity he might still have had. He felt everything inside him wavering, as if some key moment had just slipped away from him. The fingers clutching the phone began to tremble. He couldn't afford to remain in this ignorance. He needed to figure it out. Figure out what had just happened. He pulled out his phone as if trying to return to reality, to what might still be familiar, even though he knew it wouldn't be. He dialed the number and thought for a moment before pressing call. His mind was flitting between thoughts, but he acted anyway. He couldn't afford to stay in this state of uncertainty, in this space where everything was in question, where every move he made might not be what he thought it was. His gaze drifted back to the street where her car had disappeared. The night was dark, and all the lights seemed so far away. She seemed to have taken not only the answers with her, but his confidence as well. With every passing second, everything in the city was becoming a jumble. "Hello?" came the voice on the other end of the line. He exhaled, gaining a full voice. "It's Peters. We have a problem. We need to talk right away." He felt everything inside him freeze as the words left him, but even in that confusion he knew he had to figure it out before it was too late. We'd love it if you could share with us where you're listening to this story from. Your thoughts and impressions are very important to us, and we look forward to your comments. What did you think of the plot twists and turns? What do you think of the relationships between the characters and the mysterious Olivia? We value your opinion, and every comment helps us get better.